mean you should despise sermons, even of preachers you dislike. For the discourse is often much better than the man. The sweet and clear waters come through very dirty earth. I am the more particular on this head, as you seem to express a little before I came away some inclination to leave our church, which I would not have you do. The year before that, he'd written to his wife, you spend your Sunday very well, but I think you should go oftener to church. And a youthful admirer, Catherine Ray, she wrote him a letter and he writes back to her, be a good girl and don't forget your catechism. Go constantly to meeting or church till you get a good husband. Then stay at home and nurse the children and live like a Christian. Not necessarily saying he believes in Christian doctrine, but he's seeing that this has a beneficial effect on people. Well, by the time we reach the Constitutional Convention, now it's 1787, Franklin is there. Franklin is, by this time, 81 years old. There was a time when I thought 81 was very old. I am coming to question that. But there at the convention, they're in danger of breaking up because there's dispute commercial versus the agricultural states, the northern states versus the southern states, questions concerning whether slaves should be counted as regular persons for purposes of taxation and for purposes of representation. With all of these questions, such discord at the convention that finally on June 28th, Ben Franklin stands up. And here's what he says. In the situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? There are some who say that that phrase, Father of lights, that shows that Franklin was a deist, that he'd use an impersonal expression like that from God. Well, if so, the author of the book of James was a deist, because that's where the expression comes from. In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayers in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. That doesn't sound like a deist. I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. Again, you don't have to be a Christian to believe God governs in the affairs of men, but that is as direct a repudiation of deism as he can possibly make. He goes on to say, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. Franklin has probably not become a Christian in any orthodox sense of the word, but he's clearly moved from deism, at least, to something like Unitarianism. Several years after that, 1790, he's 84 years old at this time, and the president of Yale, a very staunch Puritan by the name of Ezra Stiles, wrote him a letter in which he asked his opinion of Jesus of Nazareth. Here's Franklin's answer. As to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think his system of morals and religion as he left to us the best the world ever saw or is likely to see. But he goes on to say, I have some doubts as to his divinity. Notice he says some doubts about his divinity. He doesn't outright reject it, but when he says he has some doubts as to his divinity, that's not necessarily the same as saying he has some doubts as to whether Jesus was divine. He may be saying he has some doubts as to the nature of Jesus' divinity, whether it is the Trinitarian formula that we would believe in and that has been the position of orthodoxy at least since the Council of Nicaea, or whether maybe it's the Arian formula that yes, Jesus is the divine Son of God, but he is not equal with the Father, and he was not co-eternal with the Father. He was created at the time of his conception. Or maybe he's saying that it may be like the modalist view, the idea that there is one God, he is one essence, he is one person, but sometimes that one person appears under the mode of the Father, and sometimes under the mode of the Son, and sometimes under the mode of the Holy Spirit. So we're not sure what exactly he is saying there, whether he outright rejects the divinity of Christ, or whether he has some questions as to the nature of the divinity. But he goes on to say, though is it a question I do not dogmatize upon, having never studied it, and think it needless to busy myself with it now, when I expect soon an opportunity of knowing the truth with less trouble. Well, I'm sure he got that opportunity, but I hope it was in a way that was satisfactory. You know, he was a printer throughout his life, and I always like the epitaph that he had written, asked that this be on his tombstone, but it was not placed on his tombstone. Here's the epitaph that Ben Franklin wrote for himself. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more elegant edition, revised and corrected by the author with a capital A. Ben Franklin's view of the resurrection, whether he partakes of the resurrection in that way, we'll find out someday. But what I'd especially like to have us note about Franklin was back in 1740, we had the great religious revival in America, the revival that we know as the first Great Awakening. It was led by preachers like George Whitefield of England and Ireland, by Jonathan Edwards, by the brothers Tennant and others who preached up and down throughout the colonies, all the way from New Hampshire, all the way down to Georgia, and preached a common message of salvation. In a population that was a little more than 3 million, hundreds of thousands of people either became Christians or else rededicated their lives to Jesus Christ. And one of the effects of the Great Awakening, too, it kind of reversed the slide away from Puritan zeal of the 1600s. You know, what often happens in a society is that you have a group like the Puritans, or maybe some person who is saved and becomes a very enthusiastic and very zealous Christian, maybe even becomes a pastor, or maybe even founds a church. Then you come to the next generation, and they're good, solid believers and pillars of the church. By the third generation, they're still there and profess, but the old zeal is gone. And by the fourth generation, you don't even have a profession. That seemed to be the case with the Puritans who had come to New England back in the early 1600s. That by the 1700s, that Puritan zeal had, to a great extent, faded. But the religious revival of the 1740s, the first Great Awakening, arrested that slide away from Puritan zeal and restored it to a great extent. Although America's Christianity after the Great Awakening was never quite the same thing as it was under the Puritans, yet you probably couldn't say it was any less zealous. But one of the preachers, a man that Ben Franklin speaks about, his name was George Whitefield, and Franklin was impressed with him. Even though Whitefield was a Calvinist, a Bible-believing fundamentalist, had worked with the Wesleys, with what was called the Holy Club there at Oxford in England, But Franklin, nevertheless, is very much enamored by Whitefield. And he says, in 1739 arrived among us from Ireland the Reverend Mr. Whitefield, who had made himself remarkable there as an itinerant preacher. He was at first permitted to preach in some of our churches, but the clergy, taking a dislike to him, soon refused him their pulpits, and he was obliged to preach in the fields. The multitudes of all sects and denominations that attended his sermons were enormous, and it was a matter of speculation to me, who was one of the number, to observe the extraordinary influence of his oratory on his hearers, and how much they admired and respected him, notwithstanding his common abuse of them by assuring them that they were naturally half beasts and half devils. It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manner of our inhabitants. Far from being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in the different families of every street. Franklin is impressed, in other words, with the work that Whitefield is doing. In fact, Franklin, being a scientist, decided he would calculate one time the size of the crowd that Whitefield was preaching to. And so he looked at the dimensions of the town square, saw how many people could stand abreast in that town square, then looked to the 4 streets that came into that town square, and how many people could stand abreast in those streets, and how far down the streets the crowd was extending. And he calculated that Whitefield was preaching to an audience of over 30,000 people. Is this microphone working? It was said about Whitefield that he could make his audience cry just by pronouncing the word Mesopotamia. No, I don't have the touch. But the point is, Franklin is impressed in town after town. When Whitefield comes to preach, people are changed. Drunks become sober, bums become industrious, broken families come together. He is impressed with the results. Now, one time he writes, I did not disapprove, well, he's speaking about Whitefield's plan here to solicit contributions to build an orphan house down in Georgia. Franklin says, I did not disapprove of the design, but as Georgia was then destitute of materials and workmen, and it was proposed to send them from Philadelphia at a great expense, I thought it would have been better to build the house here and bring the children here. This I advised, but he was resolute in his first project, rejected my counsel, and I therefore refused to contribute. I happened soon after to attend one of his sermons, in the course of which I perceived he intended to finish with a collection, and I silently resolved that